Welcome to the Unit Economics Podcast. I'm Josh Stabinsky. On today's episode, I sit down with Clarke Pennington, founder of Lasso, a better-for-you gelatin brand. In this conversation, we get into what it actually looks like to build a product like this from scratch, including why texture becomes so difficult once you start adding in components like protein and fiber, and how much iteration it took to land on something that worked. We also talk through Clarke's unique approach to pricing, benchmarking against other protein snacks and working backwards from cost and margin targets early on. And lastly, we get into some of the less obvious constraints behind the business, especially around packaging and manufacturing, where even something as simple as a single-serve cup becomes a pretty complex problem to work through. I learned so much during my conversation with Clarke, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Clarke, thank you very much for taking the time to do this today. I'd love to hear a bit about your background to start, because it's a bit unconventional in the CPG space.
Yeah, sure. No, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. I'm a big fan of the podcast and glad to be here. So I grew up in South Carolina, and I moved to New York City about 9 years ago. I started my career as an investment banker at Deutsche Bank. So I was there for 6 years, and I was structuring derivatives, which is very different than anything in CPG. A lot of math for the first 6 years of my career. And then I went and I got an MBA from Columbia Business School. And while I was at Columbia Business School, one of my friends approached me and asked if I could help scale her business. She had a media licensing business that I helped scale. And I really enjoyed putting theory into practice, real time, taking marketing classes, stats, business analytics, and logging off from B school and then logging into a fun project where I could apply that learning real time. And then most recently, I worked at a consumer-focused hedge fund, where I was an investor in a long-short equity fund. And I looked at both consumer staples and discretionary names. So anything from big food to travel.
What did the, let's say, weeks and months leading up to deciding I'm going to launch a gelatin brand look like?
Yeah. So I think a lot of it is kind of rooted in how I live my life. So I struggle with chronic inflammation, or chronic pain rooted from chronic inflammation. And it was in 2024 where I saw a nephrologist, a pulmonologist, gastroenterologist, cardiologist, and I was dealing with undiagnosed pain. And I ultimately saw a nutritionist, and she recommended that I get my inflammatory markers checked. I did, and they came back as high. And so she said that I should go on a Whole30 diet for 60 days, eliminate all inflammatory foods, and kind of see how I reacted or responded to the foods that I started adding back. And so I did that, and I found that the largest culprits were gluten and refined sugar. So I was living a entirely different lifestyle. And I work out every day, and I'm always trying to get protein in. And so I knew that I wanted to start some type of healthier snack brand that had protein in it that didn't have gluten or sugar, but I wasn't sure what that looked like. I think the benefit of having worked within the consumer space for a couple of years is I'm closely following all of the big companies that, a lot of us are shopping at the store, pretty closely dialed into kind of earnings calls, what executives are saying, how these larger organizations are responding to kind of real-time shifts and changing preferences from consumers. And I saw a lot of opportunities where some of these larger bureaucratic organizations weren't moving as quickly to adapt their portfolios to ingredient changes from dissemination on social media or inclusions of protein and fiber alongside adoption of GLP-1s. And so I saw a big opportunity there. And again, I wasn't sure what that it was going to look like, but I knew it. I wanted it to be a fun snack, something somewhat novel, kind of bringing something back, tapping into nostalgia, tapping into childhood joy. And I kind of just thought what did I consume as a child that hasn't been brought back? And I realized that it could be Jello. And so I guess in the last year, I've spent building what became Lasso. And I started in my kitchen and I made probably 50 different iterations of a product that still sucked. It was like honestly gross. I feel bad for my fiance because they tried them all. And yeah, I was just like, oh my gosh, I can't get this. There's a lot of chemistry involved. It's like a really fickle product and I don't know what or how to get started on this. Last year, I'd gone to Expo West because I knew that I want to start a snack brand, but wasn't sure what. And so I kind of just like walked the floor looking for, you know, where is innovation happening? What is the innovation? And is there anyone here that could potentially help me figure out how to start a brand or get something off the ground? And so I met some food scientists there who I ultimately ended up hiring. So March 21st of last year is when I came up with the idea for gelatin. And April 29th is when I hired the food scientists. And yeah, it was an iterative process. I sent samples to my family back home. And then, yeah, I think that December, we finally landed on the final formulation. And I knew we had something good.
For listeners who might not be aware of how gelatin is traditionally made, can you just walk them through what that process looks like?
Yeah. So gelatin is a protein and it comes from a variety of sources. You can get it from cows or bovine, or you can get it from pigs, which is porcine gelatin. Those are kind of the most common ones that are available on the market. And it can come from the connective tissue or the hide of the animal. It's basically mixed with water and forms a gel-like structure. It was popularized a few hundred years ago by nobility because you needed large amounts of bone in order to be able to make gelatin. And they would boil the bones and get the gelatin that way. But you really only had access to large amounts of meat and bones if you had resources. And so it started as a very like posh cuisine hundreds of years ago. But today it's totally a different dynamic in terms of who's consuming gelatin day to day. And largely it's turned into a fairly processed food that actually lacks significant amount of gelatin. And so I saw an opportunity to actually put gelatin back into gelatin.
Talk to me a little bit about the early days of formulation and how difficult it was to nail the texture given how thoughtful you were trying to be around ingredient sourcing.
Yeah. So I think texture is like one of the most important things. So for me, it's food. So the most important was taste. Like we're putting this in our body. We need to have a sensory experience when eating this. I think the second most important was texture because when you think about consuming Jello as a child and you put the spoon in the cup, you lift it out, you see the nice like spoon cut of the Jello itself. But when you actually bite down, the taste is not first, it's the texture. And that texture of like the soft silkiness, that instant mouthfeel dissolve that you get, that is that iconic Jello experience that we kind of all had as children. And so that was very hard to achieve, especially with the inclusions of fiber and protein that I have in the product itself. And so when I first thought about texture, I bought a juicer. I went to Whole Foods and I bought like a ton of fruits and vegetables. And I was mixing gelatin with fruit and vegetable juice. And the texture is more achievable in that way. It's when you start adding the inclusions that it becomes much more difficult. It was a lot of trial and error over the course of 8 months or so, where we probably made 20 or 30 iterations of the product. And this was sampled iterations, not bench iterations. So it could have been multiples of that before we finally got a product that you'd actually want to eat. There were times where we would get samples and we'd eat them to test them and they were putrid, right? Because we're like playing with proteins and fibers and we built the base system first. So flavor is something that you add last. And so initially what we're tasting is literally gelatin and water with the inclusions. And it's not good. It was actually really gross. And so the texture just became, it was the biggest hurdle to overcome, but I think that it's what makes this product so memorable instantly.
How difficult then was it to nail the flavors? I'm curious both how challenging it was to get the flavors right and then why. So you've gone to market now with 3 flavors. Why those 3 flavors in particular?
Yeah. So I think from a flavor perspective, I really didn't know what I wanted to do. And so the way that I kind of thought about this was what other brands on the market have maybe come to the market recently that are using interesting flavor combinations or just like bringing some nostalgic flavors back to life. And so I have access to something called Ahrefs, which you can basically track organic key terms to websites. And so what I looked to was some mainstream soda brands like your Ollipops and Poppies. And I looked at the keyword search that was driving organic traffic to their site, which pages were getting the most traffic, which flavors were getting the most traffic. And I put together a list in a spreadsheet of those flavors. And then I also tapped in some research of like, what are the strongest launch flavors for new brands? And then I looked at, okay, what are my potential target demographics? Which flavors will appeal to those target demographics? And do I have a range? Because this product isn't just for one person, it could span generations. And so I came up with maybe a list of like 25 flavors. I then narrowed it down to 6. With those 6 flavors, pre product, I hired a growth marketer and I tested ads for 3 months with traffic tests to figure out A, who is my target demographic? B, what is their willingness to spend? And C, which flavors are leading to the highest conversion? And that's how I nailed down the 3 flavors that I launched with.
It's a bit unconventional to hire a growth marketer pre-launch, and I'm wondering if you think that decision sort of stems from your background in finance, and how much of what went on operationally looked different due to your background, and maybe what some of the pros and cons of having a more unconventional financial background might be.
Yeah, I think that when you work at a bank, you become really hyper focused at execution. You're basically just like thrown into the fire and they tell you to figure it out. And so I think that having the ability to problem solve very fast came in really handy. I think being very proficient in Excel helped where I was negotiating prices before I even placed orders on certain things. And I was running the math on margins at the same time things are being formulated. So I was very cognizant of what my cogs were from day one. And I think that that has really helped me now where I'm making minor tweaks daily to improve my margins. But had I not set myself up early and unlocked what I thought were maybe the biggest pricing headwinds from a COGS perspective, I think that having financial literacy around where my COGS probably should be and like what actually makes sense here and like what's sustainable from an economics perspective probably gave me a big advantage and probably still does and probably will for a while. Because I'll be honest, like this is hard. Like the economics around starting a CPG brand is nothing like anything that I dealt with when I was an investment banker or when I was an investor at a hedge fund. Like I'm looking at totally different math than I would have normally. Like I did basically calculus on a daily basis for 6 years when I was structuring derivatives at a bank. This is not that. And this is somewhat more confusing than a Black-Scholes model. And so I think that having any type of financial literacy puts you in a better position because none of it's easy.
Can you expand a bit just for listeners who might not understand or might not be familiar with, exactly what you're describing, like what in particular is more confusing or challenging in the way that you're alluding to?
I think when you look to go develop your pricing across channels, everyone does it a different way. There's more of like here's an easy approach. That easy approach may say, okay, this is what your COGS are. This is the margin target that you need to reach. So this is what your list price is. From your list price, this is the markup to a distributor. From the marked up distributor price, how much is a retailer going to mark that up? I think that's like the most basic way to think about it. When you start layering in like trade spend and discounts and allowances and some of your free fills or slotting, it really adds layers of complexity to your pricing algorithm. And it's very different across channels. It's very different for each retailer. And so it gets pretty complicated pretty fast. I also think that retail is its own business. When you have a DTC business at the same time and you launch both at the same time, you don't have one business, you have two. And pricing looks different in both channels, but you want them to be consistent across channels. Your margins might look better on Shopify, D2C, but you need kind of the same pricing for Shopify that you do in retail. And so I think when you start looking at your pricing, think about it, what it looks like in retail. Worst case today, you might get scale economies over time, but you should price in D2C based off of what you're pricing in retail and not the other way around. I think some people start D2C first and realize that they may have made a mistake when they go to approach retail.
Yeah. Let's talk a bit about launch. So you launched direct to consumer.
Yeah.
So let's take a step back actually.
Okay.
You get the product in hand, the flavors are right, which for listeners who might not be familiar, let's just clarify what did you launch with? What 3 flavors?
Yeah. So I launched with a crisp apple, a watermelon lime, and an orange cream. I wanted a nostalgic flavor, which was the orange cream. I wanted a combination flavor, which was the watermelon lime. And I wanted like an everyday flavor that could appeal to anyone, any time of day. And that was the crisp apple.
Makes complete sense. So flavors in hand, product in hand, ready to go. Talk to me a bit about what it looked like to launch and why you chose to launch direct to consumer first and how you're thinking about direct to consumer before we jump into retail, like how you're thinking about the role that direct to consumer will play for you over time.
Yeah. So I honestly wasn't sure how I was going to approach this from the start. And I think I went back and forth a lot of times before I figured out which path I was going to take, whether it be D2C primarily, D2C alongside retail, D2C for a short time before entering retail, or just straight to retail. I think the most important unlock was when I realized this product could be shelf stable. So because the product is shelf stable, D2C then works. And so I think that was like a nice unlock that, okay, maybe D2C is a viable path forward. But I wasn't sure how I could build a sizable D2C business or even a profitable one from the start. I think the way that I thought about this was going into D2C buys me time. It buys me time to iterate. It buys me time to launch with an imperfect product. It buys me time to test live in the market with current consumers, get their feedback, make changes before I actually go into retail. And so I think that time allowed me to launch much faster than I probably otherwise would have, because I think that overall my product's great. Like the product tastes great. The packaging, it could use a little bit of work right now, but I think that there are some hurdles from an investment perspective that I didn't want to take on until I saw solid consumer traction in the market. And so I knew that I wanted to launch with an imperfect product, knowing that I would need to invest into machinery, equipment, packaging supplies in order to get it right. But I wanted the traction first. And so that's kind of how I thought about it from a D2C perspective, is that I could test in D2C and iterate in D2C faster than I could in retail. Because if you get it wrong in retail, you're done. And so I wanted to allow myself that time. And I think that in combination, around the same time when I was thinking about the spend it would take to perfect the product, I came across an advertising agency and I was really impressed with what they were doing. And I thought that, you know what, let's send it. And so I hired probably one of the best D2C advertising agencies in the country. Full service across TikTok, Amazon, Google, Meta, Lifecycle, and launched with them the same time I launched. That will allow me to scale really fast online. It will allow me to be sold in every state in the country before I even reach retail. So then I have proof points going into retail and I can say, hey, look, this is the demographics that's purchasing Lasso online. These are the demographics of Lasso purchasers within a 5 mile radius of your store. And so I think that it makes it a little more compelling of a conversation when you bring a data story to a retailer. And so D2C, sure, it gives me higher margins. It allows me to bolster my cash flow before I enter into retail so that I don't have to raise money from the start. I think that it also allows me to test product before it's fully live in retail. It gives me a lot of data. And I just think that the data is so important in terms of how you approach retailers and even just iterate your product to make it even better.
Yeah, I'm a data person. I'm a data scientist by trade. And I think the data that you can extract from D2C is honestly fairly understated when it comes to thinking about the role that D2C plays. So I appreciate that. I'm interested to hear a bit about the decision to offer a lot of flexibility in your subscription offering. I spoke with Adam Gilman, who is one of the co-founders of Haya, the children's vitamin company, and they also offered a lot and still offer a lot of flexibility around their subscription order to order, the flavors being offered, the customizability, and it seems to be a really strong lever or tool for increasing retention on the subscription front. But given that you're fairly early, I'm not sure that that's precisely why you went about allowing for so much flexibility. So I'm just curious to hear a bit about what you see the role of your subscription business playing over time as well.
Yeah. I think that for new brands, one of the hardest things is inducing trial. I think with D2C, it's even more difficult because they can't touch or feel the product in their hands before they purchase it. So I think that offering a lot of flexibility in terms of like mix and match or subscribe and save or bulk discounts to save offer different entry points for different consumers because everyone has a different willingness to spend. And I think that you reduce friction from a purchase perspective. And also like everyone wants something a little bit different. Everyone wants to customize their cart. And so I think offering that option really helps. And like given the current environment that we are where consumers continue to trade down, they continue to seek value. If you can offer some type of value from the start, whether it be a subscription or bulk discounts, I think that you learn what the consumer is willing to pay for and kind of what price point per cup makes the most sense to them. And so again, you're testing kind of like price per cup relative to like what retail might look like in the future.
Yeah, let's talk on that topic. Let's talk about pricing because at your current price point, it's significantly higher than Jello. But if you compare this product to a protein snack, it's cheaper and it sits differently when compared that way. So I'm curious to hear about both how you arrived at this price point and then also how you think about the positioning of the product itself in that regard.
Yeah. So I think that from a pricing perspective, the way that I thought about this was again pretty data driven. My product has 10 grams of protein and 5 grams of fiber. How I kind of looked at this, I looked at yogurt, I looked at protein shakes, I looked at protein bars, I looked at fiber bars, and I looked at what the shelf price is for each of those products. And I probably have a list of like 40 products in a spreadsheet. I then looked at like what the macronutrient profile is, how many grams of fiber, how many grams of protein per product. I added grams of protein, grams of fiber. I divided that into the shelf price to figure out what people are paying per gram of functional benefit. That's how I price this product.
First of all, very cool, very different approach, I think. So when Lasso winds up in retail on shelf, where do you see the product sitting, like physically in the store?
So it's a shelf stable product. And so you think, oh, you don't need refrigeration. Why not just put it center of store? I think that from a positioning perspective, this is a premium product. And you really want to position a product in a space where people can make assumptions. And if that assumption is Lasso is in the refrigerated shelf set, people might assume that it's a fresher or more premium product than if it were sitting center of store. And so that's kind of how I'm thinking about it in terms of where it lives on shelf. A lot of products that sit in the refrigerated section are ambiently distributed, refrigerated placement. Some of it has to do with convenience and what the consumer is reaching for. Some of it has to do with how consumers move around the store. I think that a lot of people search the center and shop the perimeter. And so if you're center of store and let's say someone needs like a can of green beans, they're going to overlook whatever other products are in that aisle and go straight to the green beans. Whereas if someone's shopping milk and eggs and butter kind of at the same time, they know that they all need products on the perimeter and they're kind of like moseying from one to the other, looking kind of in this like premium shelf space, what other products might catch their eye. And so I knew that I wanted to live there. And if you think about, just gelatin generally, you've got two large brands, Snack Pack owned by Conagra, Jello owned by Kraft Heinz. Jello is in the refrigerated set. Snack Pack is in center of store. One of them has a more premium connotation and price point than the other. And so that's kind of like how I am thinking about it from like a positioning perspective. Also, I save on all of the challenges around refrigerated distribution and storage because the product is shelf stable.
So when we maybe you just answered this question, but when when we think about or when you think about the branding itself, it's sort of leading more with nostalgia and that narrative as opposed to the science and the macros. And I'm curious why that is when that is such a pivotal part of the story.
I think that trends and preferences change over time. When you think about the gelatin category as a whole, it hasn't seen much innovation in 20 or 30 years. When you think about preferences around macronutrients, that has been really hyper focused in the last 10 to 15 years. Lasso is a better for you gelatin brand, first and foremost. The inclusion of protein and fiber are to appeal to today's consumer and how they're shopping today. But it's not the whole story. Also, it's a dessert, and dessert is a different consumption occasion. You can consume it as a snack like anything else, but it's also a mindful indulgence. And I think a lot of people today reserve their indulgences for the weekend. And I like to think that this is an everyday dessert. And so leaning into this being your little sweet treat after dinner, you can like go to the fridge, grab a Lasso and just like crush it. Or it's like, I don't know, mid-afternoon and you want like something with your coffee. It's also easy. And so I think that from a brand world perspective, we really wanted to lean into like this dessert nostalgia that felt familiar. It was approachable. It conveyed deliciousness and didn't lean into like a preachy diet culture or overly clinical aesthetic because I think a lot of those can be trends that are short lived and you really don't know how long that is going to last. Whereas if you lean into an everyday sweet treat, an indulgence, nostalgia, those are things that kind of have staying power.
Absolutely. I'm interested to hear then how you're seeing your customers actually consume the product day to day. Is that behavior showing up the way you were sort of hoping it would? And how are you monitoring that?
I'm gonna candidly say that I don't really know at this point. We've got about a month and a week of data. So it's pretty light. I will say from the breakdown of the demographics that we've seen so far, it's pretty spot on in terms of who we're targeting and the use case that we're targeting. So in the last couple of weeks, we've run several dozen ads, and each one has different hierarchy of messaging. And we can look at the ROAS of those ads and basically pinpoint what the consumption occasion could be. But I can't definitively say I have enough data yet to map that precisely. But I think it's largely millennial moms shopping for their kids for a lunchbox item, or it's young professionals that want like a cleaner snack with better macros, or Gen Z that want like a fun way to get their macros. But I think that from a hierarchy perspective and messaging, we're seeing the dessert consumption definitely come into play.
I'm really glad you teed up this question perfectly. So, when you think about the millennial mom buying Lasso for her kid's lunchbox, how do you think about branding when it comes to trying to position the product in a way that will appeal to both parents and children? Because children do feel like a huge demographic that you will ultimately be, maybe second order selling to.
Yeah. So I think that when you think about just like moms generally, they're the largest contingency of shoppers that go grocery shopping. So they're the ones that you're largely selling to. I think that online, Gen Z controls the narrative. And even if you are a millennial mom, you're following that the like New York City or LA it girl or Austin it girl of like whatever they're doing on social media, you're interested in that. And so I think that when you try to speak to millennial mom, it may not even be speaking directly to her. It's probably speaking to her through a 23-year-old. And that's kind of like how we've approached this in terms of like how we created the branding such that it appeals to a wide demographic and not just a subset or the primary subset of our demographic. We want it to feel indulgent, but authoritative without feeling overly preachy around macros or gut health.
So maybe it doesn't even matter how the branding resonates with children because it's at the end of the day, it's Jello. They're gonna like the product.
Yeah, I think that from a branding perspective, they're not really going to care. I think that they like cartoons, they like fun stuff, but they also like color. And what's great about Jello is it's color and we eat with our eyes. And so it's a clear cup. So kids don't need a cartoon. They like red. They're going to go for something that's red. And a lot of Gen Alpha, their parents haven't given them Jello because it has preservatives, artificial colors, sucralose, or 17 grams of sugar. And so even in a lot of natural stores across the country, they don't even carry Jello because their consumers aren't buying it. And so it's a novel sensory experience for Gen Alpha. They've never had Jello. They don't know what it tastes like. And so the toddlers that have tried Lasso, they're obsessed and they don't know anything about branding or like really even have a sense of like what is packaging. But the product itself resonates with them because of this novel texture that they've never experienced.
That makes complete sense. I know you just launched, so be that as it may, I'm curious to hear a bit about how you're thinking about new flavor introduction. I ask this question often. People seem to go to market with three flavors, actually fairly often it appears. But I've been pleasantly surprised by the variety in responses to this question. So I'm curious how you're thinking about new flavor introduction. I'm sure you're sitting on a number of other flavors that you could have rolled out because you had 30 in the bag. So I'm curious, like, when is it time to release one of those flavors to launch something new? You've maybe already gone through the process of greenlighting the actual flavor itself. So what tells you it's time 3, 6, 12, 24 months from now that it's actually time to launch one of those flavors?
I think that's a really good question. I think it's very difficult to answer. There's two sides to this. I think one is keep your SKUs tight, keep your COGS tight, keep the POs to a minimum so that you're not sending purchase orders out for 1,000 ingredients because each flavor has a different ingredient profile. On the other hand, consumers are asking for new flavors. You want to introduce a shiny new object to have new Instagram or TikToks or just marketing generally around the introduction of a new flavor. The way that I'm thinking about this, because flavors for me and for Lasso are a little different because the product is different. My product is fairly equivalent to a beverage in terms of you have a base system and you just add a flavor to it. And that makes it really easy to introduce new flavors without throwing off your supply chain. I have a fourth flavor that I'm sitting on. It will be introduced at some point. Do I know when that is? No, not the exact date, but yes, I know when I will introduce another flavor. But in what capacity and whether or not I make that like a retailer exclusive or just launch one on D2C. I guess I'm fortunate because my base is the same across flavors. And the only thing that I'm really tweaking is the flavor profile, which is pretty easy adjustment with flavor and fruit juice. And so I think that I can quickly roll out as many flavors as I want. And it's basically dependent on packaging lead times. Whereas for others, it could be like, I don't know, if I'm a cracker, then a flavor of a cracker beyond just changing a spice becomes a lot more complicated.
I think this parallel or drawing this comparison to a beverage company is like spot on. And this idea of having the base system makes complete sense. Would you consider introducing a mystery flavor? I miss the mystery flavors that we grew up with, and no one seems to be doing it. If people remember, like the white airhead,
The white airhead is a great example of a mystery flavor.
right? Like, why is no one doing mystery flavor anymore? And if people are doing mystery flavor and I'm not familiar with it, please somebody let me know. But I'm curious if you'd ever consider that.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And I probably just like take that idea and run with it. I think it's brilliant.
Please do. I'd love to see it. So you're going up against some really large incumbents that you've already mentioned. And
Yeah.
your moat, your differentiating factors are really obvious. They're very apparent. We've talked about them at length at this point. But I'm curious to hear a bit about if there's been any surprises in just going up against Goliaths since launching the brand. Anything that you weren't expecting?
Yeah, I think the hardest part has been piecing this together. I think that when you see a product on shelf, you don't necessarily understand how that product came to be put together. For example, this is my product. It looks pretty simple. It's got gelatin on the inside, a lid, and a cup. What was very difficult about this is these two packaging components are not the easiest things to source. When you think about Jello and snack pack or any single serve cup, like yogurt is pretty easy. You can go grab a 5-ounce yogurt cup off the shelf, tons of suppliers to go grab one of those. If you want a cup where you can see the product inside, it becomes a lot more difficult because of the application around how to even make this. And there are other things involved from a chemistry perspective, like heat and acidity, things like that, that impact what type of packaging you actually end up putting this in. And what I found is given how gelatin is made, like the end product of gelatin cup, it doesn't work in every cup type that is easily available on the market. And so I'm having to invest into creating a new cup that can withstand the factors that play into gelatin sitting in this cup for its shelf life. And so I think that when you go up against incumbents and there's really no other new entrants, and it's this isn't a saturated market. It's very concentrated with two players that basically own the entire market. They own the entire supply chain. They own the entire packaging. Like Jello probably has a facility where they're stamping cups on the line, putting the product in those cups that they stamped, and then putting a lid on it on that line. It's all custom. There's no stock Jello cup. And so if you want to go make Jello, there's no stock Jello cup anywhere in the world because there's only 2 manufacturers of Jello. And so I have to then go buy packaging and invest in machinery that allows me to make this. Oh, because also there's co-manufacturers, right? And the co-manufacturers that can service to make this type of product make a different type of product, but that product is only sold in smaller quantities. It's not high volume like a beverage or a gelatin cup. And so because it's lower volume, they don't have the capacity for me to even grow into. So they might have the machinery, but they could probably only satisfy volumes for like 3 days of supply that I actually need. And so with that, I then need to go buy special equipment to make this product, which costs an insane amount of money. And so I think that the combination of like machinery and packaging not being readily available and capacity not being readily available makes it really challenging when you go into a market that has 80% market share across 2 players.
That is fascinating. How are you thinking about financing the purchase of said machinery? Are you thinking about raising money? I know it's early days, but that's such a unique problem to be faced with so early on. I'm really interested to hear a little bit more specifically about how you're thinking about getting that done.
Yeah. So eventually I will raise capital. I haven't yet, and I might not for a while. I am in a fortunate situation where I don't necessarily need to go raise capital. I wouldn't call it bootstrapping, but I wouldn't say that I need to raise VC money. I worked in finance for 10 years. So, and I basically just sat at a desk for 14, 16 hours a day and spent no money. So I'm in a situation where I can just like play around for a little while and figure it out before I need to go like super dilute myself. And so that's kind of how I'm approaching this is I see the market opportunity. I have early proof point and I wanted to wait and see that I had that traction before making that investment. And then I also did Expo West at the same time that I launched, which I think that a lot of people fail to see ROI from. I cannot say the same. And I think that when you're tapping into a very sleepy category that hasn't been innovated in 20 to 30 years, there's a lot of retailer demand immediately for that product. There's a lot of consumer interest from a novelty perspective. And there's a lot of interest from an investor perspective that see the size of the market and see that there's been limited entrants that have done this successfully. And so, really, right now, the largest risk for me is execution. And so, because I have call it validation from consumers, retailers, and investors, it makes a lot of sense for me to put my own money on the line and go into this and make those investments to scale faster.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate the transparency. I think, yeah, listeners are often wondering, like, how does this work? So I do sincerely appreciate the transparency there.
Yeah, of course.
I think we have time for one more question. Where do you see Lasso 3 to 5 years from now?
Yeah. So I think 3 years from now, hopefully I have gotten to a place where you can drive down the road and pick it up from a local supermarket, natural grocery store, maybe a mass store, maybe a food service. 5 years from now, hopefully you see it everywhere and you can't walk into a store without seeing it. Like a beverage, like an lollipop, like a poppy.
Amazing. Well, I cannot wait to follow along. Clarke, thank you so much for the time today. I really appreciate it. If you want to share with listeners where they can find Lasso, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, sure. No, this is great. You can find Lasso online, eatlasso.com. We're also available in TikTok Shop.
Incredible. Thank you so much.
Yep. Thanks.
All right, let's debrief. What Clarke is up against here is pretty unusual. He's entering a category that's effectively controlled by 2 incumbents, where a lot of the underlying infrastructure, especially around packaging and production, is not readily available. So it isn't just about making a better product. Clarke has to figure out how to produce at scale when the default options don't really exist, whether that's sourcing the right cup, finding capacity, or investing in equipment much earlier than one might expect. And I think for me, the main takeaway here is that if you're building a physical product, you need to map the constraints earlier than you think. You can't just validate the idea or demand. You have to spend real time understanding your packaging and manufacturing and supply chain constraints before you scale, because those decisions will define your cost structure and your speed, and in some cases, whether or not the business even works at all. I have the utmost confidence in Clarke, and I think that Lasso will be extremely successful. But I think that's largely due to how meticulous he is and how much attention he paid to these factors so early on. I learned so much during this conversation, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. If you haven't already, make sure to follow and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.